This programme was made with the support of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland.
The staff were busy working within the GPO on that fateful Easter when rebellion's tide would flow. With seeds of freedom planted as angry bullets flew, the population questioned and confusion quickly grew. Rebel HQ, GPO.
In 1916, Easter Rising, a physical force rising or insurrection in Ireland.
The 1916 rebellion.
They went inside the GPO and seized it in the name of the Irish Republic.
They occupy the GPO on the first day of the rising and it's declared rebel headquarters.
Post office, the GPO, was the headquarters of the Irish Republic.
Why choose the GPO? I mean, what's so special about a post office?
The GPO was taken as a symbol of power, but also as the main communications centre of the whole country.
The GPO, a nerve centre of communications.
The telegraph office in the GPO was the reason for taking control of the GPO.
It was one of the principal buildings within the very substantial post office network.
It's a reflection on how important that postal system was seen to be that they decided to pick the GPO as their headquarters.
We forget these days just how vital the post office was
as a communication hub.
The 1916 Rising has been studied from many different angles over the years. But, believe it or not, the unique perspective of the GPO building itself, where the rising began, and also the central role of the GPO staff on the events of Easter week, remains largely an untold story. So how exactly did the 1916 Rising come about in the first place? Dr. Gabriel O'Doherty of the History Department, University College, Cork.
Well, in terms of the reasons why the 1916 Rising came about, in the narrow sense, it's because James Connolly, who was the leader of the Irish Citizen Army, informed the leaders of the Irish Volunteers that if they didn't strike a blow during the war, according to the dictum of England's Difficulties, Ireland Opportunity, he would take his minuscule Irish Citizen Army out onto the streets and do it for them. And of course, had that happened, it would have amounted to little more than a small skirmish, but the volunteers as well as the Citizen Army would have been disarmed. The IRB, or at least a section of the IRB that had penetrated the leadership of the volunteers, realised that Connolly was in earnest and therefore decided that to take him into their confidence about their plans for a rising. And it's from that junction of the Connollyite socialist tradition, as it were, and the separatist republican tradition embodied in the IRB, and as it were the cultural nationalist tradition embodied in Pádraig Pearse, amongst others, that the origins of the 1916 Rising can be found.
And although the Easter Rising was originally planned for Easter Sunday the 23rd of April, due to a confusion in orders and also a failure to land arms, the leaders of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB for short, decided to postpone the Rising to the following day, Easter Monday the 24th of April. To explain further, here's Stephen Ferguson, curator of the An Post Museum situated in Dublin's GPO, and also author of the book Business as Usual, GPO Staff in 1916.
Monday the 24th of April was Easter Monday, and it was a nice sunny day in Dublin. The leaders, Pearse and Connolly and the others, decided to press ahead on Easter Monday. They gathered at Liberty Hall shortly before 12 o'clock, midday, and they walked up the street, they walked up Abbey Street and turned around, wheeled round outside the GPO, and the order was given to charge in and take over the GPO. And that was why the GPO was taken as a symbol of power, but also as the main communications centre of the whole country. And that's why it was the building chosen in 1916 to be the main target for the rebels.
The 1916 Rise.
The city went to war.
They had no mandates. The 1916 rebellion didn't have a mandate. The vast majority of Dublin people were against it.
They were spat on by the Dublin people of Dublin.
It's an undemocratic act, it takes place. There's no mandate for it.
At the time, everybody was anti-rebel.
And as prior comments indicate, the 1916 leaders were very conscious they lacked a mandate and that they had to make some kind of a statement to justify the military undemocratic step they were taking. As a result, Pádraig Pearse's first action soon after entering the GPO was to come to the front of the building and read a document proclaiming the Irish Republic to be a sovereign, independent state. Stephen Ferguson.
I think the most important thing for people, apart from getting organised and getting their troops and all ready, was to explain what they were doing. Because they were aware that they were starting a rebellion and they didn't have any public authority or justification for doing this. So they had prepared a document, which is, of course, our proclamation of 1916. And that was a document that was supposed to explain the rationale behind the rebellion, give the moral justification for it, and also lay out a vision of hope for the future as to what a future Ireland could look like. And that's why the proclamation is an important document.
And to explain the proclamation further, here's John Gibney, historian and also author of the O'Brien Press 16 Lives biography of the 1916 rebel Sean Houston.
The proclamation basically starts off by stating that it names the various organisations involved, the Irish Citizen Army, the Irish Volunteers. It reveals the existence once again of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. At least it acknowledges that in public. And it basically says that the men and women involved in 1916 were just the latest in a long line of people to assert Irish independence through force of arms, and that Ireland had its sovereign and inalienable right to that independence 6 times in 300 years. Now, you can argue the toss over precisely what those 6 times were, but it's the principle that counts, that they were just the latest in a long line of people to do this. It's stated that not only were they doing this off their own bat, but they had the assistance of exiled children in America and, crucially, gallant allies in Europe. So if you need a link to the First World War in the rhetoric of the Easter Rising, it is in the document that is the most famous product of that Easter Rising.
So just how exactly was Pádraig Pearse's reading of the proclamation received by the general public? Stephen Ferguson.
When it came to be read from the front of the GPO, just at the place where our current statue of Cuchulainn is, that was the doorway at that stage, it was read from there, and really most people really didn't think it was very interesting. Some stopped to listen, but some thought, what's all this nonsense, these fellows in their uniforms playing soldiers again? And they really went on with their business, strolling along on a nice day, having an ice cream or a chat or whatever they were doing. So it didn't just have the sort of initial spark that maybe the leaders had hoped for, where people would say, well, we must join in. There were 1 or 2 people who certainly were moved by it, because 1 or 2 did come into the GPO and join the rebellion. But for most people, it wasn't of interest. They didn't know what was happening, and they just wanted to get on with their ordinary lives in the city.
So what is the proclamation's ultimate legacy? Brian Hughes, historian and researcher with the Letters of 1916 project in on Forras Fassa NUI Maynooth, and also author of the 16 Lives biography of 1916 rebel Michael Mallon.
Essentially, the proclamation has become, or seen to be viewed as the founding document of the modern state. And it's become now this sort of commodity again, where it's sort of thing that people will put up on their walls. It's almost like the Irish equivalent of the American Declaration of Independence as well.
The ultimate legacy is it's a document of vision and aspiration. And anybody who has any pretense today in political terms wants to find a link that brings them back to the proclamation in some way. Now, that's obviously not possible for all parties, but if you look at the mainstream political parties that we have today, each of them, whether it's on the Labour or Socialist side or whether it's on the Republican side, wants to be able to say, we have drawn some of our current policies and inspiration from the document that inspired those men and women. And that is the legacy and the importance of the proclamation today.
We now have a taste of just how pivotal the 1916 proclamation was in Irish history. But getting back to the 1916 Rising itself, how did things go for those postal staff who got caught up in it once the rebels took the GPO? Stephen Ferguson.
When the rebels came in, the first thing was to take over the public office, because it was a normal business day, even though it was a bank holiday and Easter Monday. But the GPO never closed, because there were always messages of importance that had to be sent. So the first thing they did was to chuck out the staff downstairs on the counters, the ordinary clerks who were there, and some shots were fired and they left, obviously, pretty pronto. What they didn't immediately think of was the telegraph staff who were upstairs in what was called the instrument room. That's just the old-fashioned language for the telegraph system that was working there. So that was up on the second floor, and it was spanning largely the width of the building across where the main public office is now. Those people heard and were able to look out the window at the commotion, and they took the decision to slam the doors on the rebels on the basis that this was not supposed to be happening. So the boss up there, a man called Sam Guthrie, he said, "Close the doors, I'm not going to talk to any of these people." And he had a guard of troops. There were 4 soldiers and a sergeant of the guard who had been put there to guard the telegraph room at the beginning of the First World War, largely in case there was any trouble from German spies or saboteurs at the time. And the boss of the post office had said, we need a small guard.
In his official eyewitness account written a few days after the 1916 Rising, Samuel Guthrie gave his version of what occurred.
At 12:30 we were informed by the sergeant of the guard that the rebels were forcing the stairs leading from Henry Street to the instrument room, and he asked me to obtain assistance for him. I explained to him what we had already done to obtain assistance. The guard consisted of a sergeant and 4 men. The passage leading from the head of the stairs to the instrument room was then barricaded from the inside by filling it with chairs, waste paper boxes, etc. In order to delay the entry of attackers as much as possible, the guard of 1 sergeant and 4 men standing inside the instrument room prepared to receive the rebels if they broke through the obstructions. Several volleys were then fired by the rebels through the passage into the instrument room.
And as the rebels opened fire, the biggest problem for those soldiers defending the instrument room in the GPO was that their guns lacked ammunition. Stephen Ferguson.
But because of the potential dangers of having live ammunition in the building, they actually had no bullets in their guns or no live ammunition. So they couldn't do anything effective to stop the rebellion happening. But they did the best they could. They had bayonets, I think. They fixed their bayonets and they closed the doors, barricaded the entrance into the room and said, "No, you're not supposed to come in." So that required shots to be fired from the rebels, and 1 soldier was injured, quite seriously injured, and the rebels couldn't get in the first door they wanted to get in, but they nipped round downstairs again and up the stairs on the southern side of the GPO. They went through what was the dining room at the time, and obviously they were able to get through there without any trouble.
And after the rebels had overcome the physical resistance of those soldiers guarding the instrument room, Samuel Guthrie's instrument room staff were ejected from the GPO. Stephen Ferguson.
They let the staff out of the GPO, which, in fairness, they had to do. These were civilians. I don't think there would ever have been any thought of keeping these people prisoner. It simply wouldn't have been done. We're thinking of an early stage in warfare where this wouldn't have happened. But once the people were out, they obviously felt it was their duty to try and inform the authorities about what was happening. They had managed to send a quick message from the GPO before the lines were entirely cut. And then the various technical and engineering staff made their way down to Amiens Street station, Connolly station as it is now, and there was a post office telegraph office there, and they then set up a communications centre there which lasted for the rest of the week, and with the help of some of the railway officials they established a temporary office there, and they rerouted their wires. And because they had the technical know-how, even though many of the wires had been very thoroughly cut by the rebels, the post office staff were able to circumvent some of these breaks and re-establish communications with England very quickly.
This message was received in London at 1:33 p.m.
Dublin informs Nevin that volunteers have taken possession of Telegraph Office at Dublin, and all links stopped in consequence.
And at 2:30 p.m. a telegram came from Amiens Street station, the terminus of the Great Northern Line from Belfast, now Connolly Station, sent by Mr. Gummersall, head of the Post Office Engineers Department in Dublin.
To Secretary, G.P.O. London. G.P.O. Dublin taken possession of today at noon by Sinn Féiners. Sorting office and instrument room wrecked. Some railway stations also held.
And a short while later, Post Office worker Samuel Guthrie contacted the Central Telegraph Office in London from Amiens Street.
I'm speaking from Amiens Street railway station. The GPO has been taken possession by the Irish volunteers who have turned out everyone. I am afraid they are bent on demolishing the instrument room. I tell you in case you may have wondered why you could not get Dublin. Will you please advise Secretary and anyone else that it may concern, and also advise any Irish stations it may be right to. I will take government work and will do my best to deliver it. The streets are not safe.
The interesting thing is here that you can still find some of these original messages in the archives. These are actually in the Post Office archives in England, and that's where I found them several years ago now. So you can gently touch some of the original papers where the messages have been copied down by the people who received them in Wales and in England. So you'll see a message that comes across from the GPO saying, GPO attacked, instrument room wrecked, volunteers intent on rebellion. This sort of short, cursory message. And that was followed up again by more messages sent from Amiens Street station further down the street. And the interesting things are that early on, the blame is put on the volunteers, for instance. And in fairness to them, it wasn't really the volunteers, it was the IRB element within the volunteers who were using this. So that there's little snappy messages sent by people who knew that everything had to be short. And there's ones that followed later in the day. There were official communications sent on a military telegraph wire from Dublin Castle, from the authorities here. There's one which is a nice one, which says, situation not satisfactory, which is a nice way of saying that, you know, that there was chaos running throughout the whole of the city.
Dublin was occupied and Dublin went to war for about a week. Much of the city centre was devastated by fires caused by artillery bombardments.
This cataclysmic event in Dublin city centre.
The city went to war. The people affected by that were not just the ones who were fighting. And amongst those ordinary men and women who were working in the city are the men and women who worked in the Irish Post Office in 1916.
These are ordinary people doing their job, and they're doing it out of what the Post Office boss at the time said was just a question of self-respect.
They felt they were simply doing their job and doing their duty. Their job was to communicate.
So just how did the many telegraphic communications crisscrossing between Ireland and Britain in the first few hours of the 1916 Rising impact upon the British government's response? Historian Stephen Ferguson.
The importance for the military was that messages about reinforcements could be sent very quickly along the restored lines. So that the initial response, I suppose, of the army was they were a little bit lackadaisical. They were caught on the wrong foot. There was all this story about the officers being down at the races and enjoying themselves at the day. So the initial response was poor. But once the lines were going again and they realised the seriousness of what was happening, there were messages going about reinforcements, about 1,600 troops coming in from barracks outside Dublin, about military artillery, guns and all that had to be brought in as well. And then by the end of the week, of course, there was substantial reinforcements coming in through Dunleary and being deployed around the city in this ever-tightening cordon. So within the first day or day and a half, the army was getting in substantial numbers of troops. So once that had happened, largely through the ingenuity of the Post Office engineering staff, probably it was going to be impossible for the rebels in Dublin to break out or to have any serious success once the cordon was tightened by increasing numbers of troops that were coming in as a result of telegrams.
And as prior Speaker Stephen Ferguson touched on, by working to restore and maintain telegraph and telephone communications, the postal staff facilitated a quicker British suppression of the rebellion than would otherwise have happened. John Gibney.
They enabled the British to become aware of what was going on, and by doing so enabled the British to take measures against what was happening. The Great Southern and Western Railway, for example, who had built Kingsbridge Station, the Great Southern and Western Railway had basically begun to mobilise hundreds, in fact thousands of troops, if I'm not mistaken, to arrive in Dublin on the Monday night. So you would have had obviously troops being mobilised in Britain itself, you know, soldiers being woken up in the middle of the night, being put onto trains, then onto troop ships, arriving in Dublin and allegedly trying to greet the locals in French because they thought they had been sent to the Western Front. But there were plenty of soldiers in Ireland, and they were brought up by rail to Dublin, and soldiers, reinforcements were arriving from places like the Curragh and Athlone by Monday night, within hours of the rebellion actually breaking out. So those messages that were gotten to London in the afternoon of the 24th of April 1916 alerted the British authorities to what was happening and enabled them to basically do something about it. The British swung into action pretty quickly. They mobilised troops that were in Dublin city centre within a matter of hours. You know, troops in the Royal Barracks were heading down the quays to investigate what was going on. But as for the wider mobilisations that were essential to crushing the Easter Rising, those messages that were sent on the 24th of April were crucial to that happening, because when the British moved, they moved very quickly.
Essentially, one thing that the post office staff really do is they facilitate the relatively speedy suppression of the rising.
Historian Brian Hughes of NUI Maynooth.
The fact that the rising, that they're able to suppress it within the space of a week, I think certainly the post office staff played their part in that. So really very early on, within an hour or two, they're able to send a message to England that the GPO has been occupied by the Irish Volunteers. By 10 to 3 in the afternoon, both the War Office and the Admiralty have news from Dublin about the rising and about what's happening. And then by 6 p.m, Birrell, the Chief Secretary, he's in London, and he actually receives a message from Sir Matthew Nathan, the Under Secretary in Dublin. So these two, the two key figures of the Irish administration, are able to communicate very, very quickly from across the Irish Sea. And then by 9 o'clock, really, Army Command are in a position to inform London of all the rebel positions, and that allows them very quickly to coordinate their response to the rising. So it allows them to decide how many troops they need, where they need to go, and how they're going to go about doing this. So that early communication is very, very important in terms of how the British can how they're able to respond to the rising.
The staff were busy working within the GPO on that fateful Easter, when rebellion's tide would flow, with seeds of freedom planted as angry bullets flew. The population questioned and confusion quickly grew. Rebel HQ, GPO. What about our jobs? The worried staff would say. How can we think to live without our weekly pay? The proclamation read, the leaders state their aim, while staff ran to Amiens Street, contact to regain. Rebel HQ, GPO. Devotion to their duty, they knew just what to do. Lines were reconnected and knowledge quickly flew. News of the rebellion reached London on that day. The staff were unaware of the role they were to play. Rebel HQ, GPO.
But it wasn't just with the restoration of communications on Easter Monday that post office staff excelled. They also maintained communications for the government throughout the week of the Rising. Historian Brian Hughes.
Not only do post office staff send the first messages, they also keep the telegraphs going, so these messages can keep coming back and forward throughout the whole week. And this allows then for coordination of strategy and for the different areas of the British response to keep in touch with each other.
I don't think it's overstating the case to say that, taken collectively, the individual efforts of post office staff, ordinary men and women, did have an outcome on what happened, because they were the only people who had the technical knowledge and expertise to make the necessary repairs, and they just went ahead and did it. The army would have had some knowledge, but throughout the First World War, for instance, the army drew on post office staff, particularly post office technical and telegraph staff, and there were often calls for some of the telegraph staff to join up, and there were several Irish staff who did join up, and of course throughout the rest of Britain, and all these people did, but they were wanted by the army because of the expertise that they had. So that the fact that these individual ordinary Irish men and women in the post office responded as they did, it did have an effect on the outcome of the rebellion. In the long run, things would have happened anyway, but it did have an effect in terms of the speed of that outcome.
The majority of the post office staff are Irish men and they're Irish women, and they're actively assisting the British forces in suppressing the rebels by keeping the telegraph open.
From the castle to Aldborough House, the loyal men remained, their duty without question done, as the streets with blood were stained. The 1916 Rising took the nation by surprise, but repression would be speedy with the keen of widows' cries. Rebel HQ, GPO, creation of a free state were Pearse and Connolly's plan. Their noble aims were thwarted when the army cannons rang. Looting and confusion, smoke and screams of pain fell on Dublin city when the Easter Rising came. Rebel HQ, GPO.
We do tend to forget, when we look at the grand sweep of history, we can often forget the nuts and bolts, the mechanics, the means by which a message might get from Dublin to London and elsewhere, the physical reality of how that happened, the fact that, people would have actually, how people did this, how the technology actually worked.
Historian John Gibney. And regarding the technical side of how postal staff kept the telegraph lines open, Stephen Ferguson elaborates.
The technical way that these things were done, if a line was damaged in a particular case, the engineering and technical people would look for a telephone subscriber who might have been in the locality, and they would reroute a line using their particular private line and take it over as part of the necessary circumstances that had to be done. And by using that, they would be able to get past the bit that had been split and or cut, and try and reroute that way using private lines.
And perhaps the post office worker most influential in keeping the government's telegraph lines open was Edward Gummersall.
Edward Gummersall, the superintending engineer, because he was the man who organised and managed and rostered the staff under him to get round the city and the outlying areas of the county and splice together the lines that needed to be done. So he was the man really who superintended the reorganisation and rerouting of communications on behalf of the government.
And the historical archives relate that in doing such work, Edward Gummersall and his staff often put themselves in harm's way.
He was putting himself in serious danger, as were some of his staff, and while I don't think they would have been deliberately shot as post office staff, I think my view is that the rebels saw these people as doing their job, and they accepted that these were Irishmen who were paid to maintain communications. And I don't think it would have been in the minds of most people just for a sniper to shoot one of them. But it would have been very easy and entirely within the realm of possibility that any ricochet bullet or a bullet from somebody's gun or a bullet shot off in the heat of the moment could well have killed somebody like this.
What is clear from prior commentary is that the failure of the rebels to destroy government communications was a major disaster for their cause. So how aware were they of the vital importance of communications? Stephen Ferguson.
The rebels had a good understanding of the importance of communications, and this is evident from some statements from people who were involved, taken subsequently. Because even several months before the rising, people like James Connolly had been making discreet inquiries about how would he cut telegraph lines if he wanted to. And he had some sympathisers within the post office, not very many, but there were some technical men who were key to what was going to happen. So they knew the importance of the GPO, and they knew the importance of establishing control of communications. So I don't think they made tactical errors. I think they were a little unlucky in that the confusion that surrounded Owen McNeill's countermanding order meant that there simply weren't enough people on the day to do all that they might have wanted to do.
I think what's important to consider in this case is that essentially the rising was going to fail militarily at some point with the numbers that they had against the British forces. Really, they weren't going to win militarily.
Historian Brian Hughes.
And it's again questionable whether they ever hoped that they would, even before the countermanding and all the various disasters. It's still not exactly clear. Certainly if all of the leaders felt that they had a chance to win militarily. But this this approach, this idea, so for example, allowing the communication staff to leave, not taking some of the important communications areas, certainly what it does is it facilitates a much speedier repression of the rising. So they certainly wouldn't have lasted, a whole lot longer. But again, they certainly could have got into a second week at least. And again, maybe a little bit longer had they done a few things differently as well. And again, if a little bit of luck had gone their way, there's also the chance that they could have held out. But again, as I say, really they're not going to win at the end of the day.
The cold hard reality of the Easter Rising is that the British succeeded in crushing it.
At the end of the day, it was a military disaster. It was a sacrifice, a blood sacrifice.
The point is that the Rising failed. If you look at it in purely military terms, it was a failure.
And of course there is a historical debate on whether they did the right thing in that they allowed themselves to be surrounded and bombarded. Maybe they should have gone and fought a guerrilla war from the very beginning. Who knows?
I think they were bad tactics, really, because they held the GPO. Well, it wasn't just the GPO, sure it wasn't. There was Boland's Mills and Jacob's factory, and took our buildings and tried to hold them. It's astonishing that they lasted a week even. Well, it wasn't even a week, 6 days.
Not a very, very good military strategy. Things kind of got bungled militarily.
And one of the key reasons why things got bungled for the rebels militarily was just plain ordinary bad luck. A prime example of such bad luck was the rebels' failure to take the vitally important Dublin telephone exchange, situated just off Dame Street. Believe it or not, for the first few hours of the rising, the exchange was left completely undefended. Stephen Ferguson.
Within the early period, it might well have been taken. And there's certainly one story that a passing lady was there. She saw some of the rebels coming along, and whether by accident or design or whatever, she said, the place is crawling with troops, lads, you better go. Something like that. And it could have been that even an offhand remark like that, whether it was delivered deliberately or unconsciously or sensibly, who knows, something like that might have prevented the rebels from pressing ahead and saying, we've got to take this now, this is the opportunity to take it. Because very shortly, once they dithered a little bit, the army got in quickly and sent soldiers to protect the telephone exchange. And once they were there, it was a defensive position and it would have been very hard to take.
And extreme bad luck also dogged the rebels' efforts to take Dublin Castle, the then seat of British rule in Ireland. And regarding Post Office telegraphist J.J. Fogarty's eyewitness account of how the rebel attack on the castle fared, as well as why it failed, UCC historian Gabriel O'Doherty shares his views.
Fogarty's account of his experience in Dublin Castle on Easter Monday and throughout Easter week is one of a very, very small number of contemporary eyewitness accounts that were written at the time, that weren't written after the fact, which of course could always be in theory contaminated, as it were, by subsequent events. But he kept, certainly on the Easter Monday, sort of almost a minute-by-minute account of what was happening from his position within Dublin Castle. And what his diary shows is just how incredibly vulnerable Dublin Castle was on Easter Monday, virtually undefended. In many respects, one could argue that had Pearse, Connolly, etc. decided to focus their attention on Dublin Castle rather than the GPO, they would have seized a much greater prize, and also one that in some respects would have been rather more easily defended than the GPO, as well as having perhaps even greater symbolic value. There was almost nobody in Dublin Castle. There was a few cleaners and there was a few messengers. He himself was on duty. And he shows that arguably, it sounds almost bizarre, but that the volunteers who were attacking Dublin Castle and who shot a policeman at this stage were making it inside the doors, as it were, and then a policeman shut a door very loudly, and this sounded like a gunshot to the volunteers, and the small number of volunteers believed that couldn't scarcely believe that there were so few defenders that they come across, so believed that there must be some other defenders around, and believed that this shot was the first of many that might be coming in their direction. And so they beat a retreat back over to basically City Hall.
And here's what Postal employee J.J. Fogarty had to say in his official eyewitness account about the rebel attack on Dublin Castle.
About 12:10 p.m, we heard several shots in the street just outside our office, and looking out the gate, a policeman could be seen lying on the ground. 5 or 6 Irish volunteers in green uniform could be seen firing from Castle Street at the guard, who withdrew inside the guard room, one of the sentries half shutting the large gate. The volunteers then advanced through the gate, and 2 or 3 endeavoured to enter the guard room. The others came right into the middle of the castle yard. I left the office to seek instructions from the Under-Secretary, and as I crossed the hall, the policeman on duty closed the door with a loud bang, the report of which startled the volunteers, about 4 in number, who quickly withdrew from the castle and, joined by others, entered the City Hall.
It's very interesting to speculate what would have happened had that door not been shut, and it's on these small little incidents that in some respects bigger issues pan out. I mean, had the volunteers occupied Dublin Castle at the bare minimum, if the British had attacked and if that garrison had been reinforced, it would have led to the destruction of a large proportion of British administrative records, police records, prison records, the general administration of Ireland, the Chief Secretary's offices, files, and so on and so forth. And so would have produced a devastating blow to the British from an administrative point of view. The destruction of the GPO was serious, but had destruction of the Dublin Castle taken place on a similar scale, the effects from the point of view of British administration in Ireland would have been far, far greater.
And aside from J.J. Fogarty, another postal worker to get caught up in the rising was J.H. Reeves. He was in charge of the post office stores depot at Aldborough House in Dublin's north inner city. Stephen Ferguson.
J.H. Reeves, he was up in Aldborough House, which is still there, a big building, originally a private house for somebody, Lord Aldborough. But it was the post office stores headquarters. And he was there with some post office staff, and he noticed the gradual build-up of rebel activity around that area. Closed the doors. The rebels didn't attempt to take Aldborough House, but he saw what was going on around it, and it was a very hot spot for sniping and engagement for a couple of days. But Reeves was the man who made sure that his fellow officers in the post office were getting some of the equipment, the technical equipment that was necessary to repair some of the damage around the place. So he sort of slipped out now and again at considerable personal danger to himself, went through various army sentry points, went past some rebel sentry points on the basis that he was just a post office employee, and went about his business trying to secure the necessary supplies for what was going on. But he was also... He had been a soldier briefly himself. I think he served in the Boer War. So he had some sort of army background and experience and knew what was going on. So he has little interesting memories of going past points where he sees some young rebel, only a boy or something, and says, don't shoot me, you'll get into awful trouble. And he manages to get on past this sort of thing.
Having settled matters and the necessary staff having arrived into Aldborough House, I tried at about 6 p.m. to get home on a bicycle. About a mile from the depot, I ran into a patrol of Sinn Féiners actually in action with the military. One young gentleman pointed his rifle at me, but when I bellowed at him not to fire, "Don't shoot me, you'll get into awful trouble," he lowered his rifle and told me to turn back. Well, this I did and remained at the depot for some hours longer. 1 or 2 small demands for Amiens Street were executed during the evening. It was a curious and somewhat exciting experience to sit in my room on the ground floor and see parties of armed volunteers escorting wagon loads of ammunition and supplies to various pre-appointed destinations.
And it's important to stress that while the majority of Irish postal staff caught up in 1916 worked to restore and maintain government communications, nevertheless, a small minority of them actually assisted the rebels. Stephen Ferguson.
There were several people who did this, and the people who were particularly influential were the technical and engineering staff. One of the senior figures would have been Dick Mulcahy, who of course went on to become a well-known person within the government and the army later on. But Mulcahy was one man. There were another couple of brothers, Martin and George King, who were on the Citizen Army side. They went around the city on Good Friday, and between them they identified key junction boxes within the city centre where particular lines needed to be severed. There was a line, for instance, to the castle. There was a line at Lombard Street, Talbot Street junctions. They knew intimately where the main official communications lines were. And Gomersall, back to the man on the other side, the superintendent on the engineering side, he, for instance, when he was going round during the week afterwards, he found little saws down manholes which had been used to sever particular lines. So you had within the same office, and maybe people who sat down for their breakfast or their lunch together, who had different political opinions, worked in the same division of the post office. Some of them were out cutting the lines of communication that their colleagues a few days later would be trying to splice together again. That's Irish history and Irish politics for you.
John Bull mobilised, the troops were on their way. Porrick Pierce surrendered on the 6th rebellious day. Rebel HQ, GPO.
On Saturday the 29th of April, just 6 days after the Easter Rising had begun, the rebel leader Porrick Pierce unconditionally surrendered to Brigadier General Lowe. After the rising, despite the GPO being destroyed, the postal staff nevertheless found alternative work buildings and quickly restored postal services throughout Dublin City. NUI Maynooth historian Brian Hughes.
But once the rising has been suppressed, then the work to restore the postal service really is, it's very, very quick. On the 3rd of May, a kind of a temporary office is opened in the Rotunda, so the GPO, for the purposes of getting the post back in order, is useless. It's more or less a shell of a building. So the Rotunda is used, and really by the 4th of May, people are getting letters, which is a remarkable, considering the turmoil and the uproar in the city. That's a huge, quick turnaround, which is really, really important.
They worked very fast. The technical work had been going on, obviously, as part of the rebellion itself, so that these lines were restored. The actual mail service, the postal service, as we think of it in terms of the post office, it was obviously impossible to do anything with that when the rebellion was going on. But within a few days of the end of the rebellion, a couple of small mail dispatches had been made to England. You've got to think back that at this stage, while the telegraph system and telephones were there, most communications and bulkier communications had to be sent by post. So the government authorities were very keen that an ordinary postal service would be re-established.
Stephen Ferguson. Ordinary citizens in Dublin were also anxious to see a resumption of postal services. Citizens such as TCD medical student Doherty Stopford Price. Brian Hughes.
For her, the two big signs that normality is starting to return after the rising has ended is the sight of a bread van. So the food situation becoming back to normal, and then the first delivery of letters on the 4th of May. And she's actually disappointed that she doesn't get any letters herself.
Also in the aftermath of the rising, plans were made to restore the GPO. Stephen Ferguson.
The GPO obviously was a wreck immediately after the rebellion. It had been bombarded and fired on from field guns up around Trinity, from the Helga in the River Liffey, and there had been fires throughout the whole place. So the GPO was a shell. And for those who worked in it, it was probably a particularly bitter disappointment, because there had been extensive renovation works had gone on, and the building had only just been opened a couple of weeks before the rebellion happened. So that there'd been a big programme of expansion and renovation and everything like that. So no doubt the post office bosses thought this is what they just didn't need. But fairly soon after the rebellion was over and things got back to some sort of normality, a decision was taken that they would rebuild. The plans were still fresh in people's minds. The architectural plans were there. The experts said, after they had looked at the shell of the building, it was possible to rebuild it. Some thought was given to moving to other premises, but by and large people wanted to stay. But the whole complexion of Irish politics obviously had changed. When people came back from their deportation and imprisonment, the mood of Ireland had changed a lot. The War of Independence obviously happened, the Civil War happened, and it wasn't possible to do anything with the GPO itself until the mid-1920s. Clearly, postal operations went on ahead. There were temporary premises taken up at the Rotunda Hospital. There was a sorting office set up there. The parcels office in Amiens Street was used as a telegraph centre, and the post office went on with its business in other city buildings. Eventually, the plan for rebuilding began in the mid-1920s under the Board of Works architect T.J. Byrne, who was responsible for work on the Custom House, on the forecourts and on the GPO. And the building was reopened officially in July 1929. And at that stage, of course, it had become something in the public mind with which it's still associated. It's not a shrine. It's not right to think of this building as a shrine, but it does mark something of particular significance in the history of Irish independence.
And perhaps one of the most famous memorials to the 1916 Rising is the Cuchulainn statue, which stands in the GPO's main hall nowadays. The statue was sculpted by Oliver Shepherd in 1911 and placed within the GPO in 1935. Historian John Gibney.
The statue of Cuchulainn in the GPO, it's an impressive statue. It's the death of Cuchulainn. He has been famous. He has been tied to the post. He has his weapon in his hand. The image of him standing up has been enough to convince his enemies that he can still fight them, so they've kept their distance. And the ruse is only revealed when the raven famously lands on his shoulder.
In Ireland, the Cuchulainn statue, as it were, expresses, Manu, the values of the Republic.
Historian Gabriel O'Doherty of University College, Cork.
You could argue that statue is the wording of the 1916 proclamation made concrete, or at least made alabaster or stone, whatever the material from which it's constructed. It is an expression of continuity from the past to the present. It's an expression of all-Ireland identity. It's a question of heroic struggle against overwhelming odds, and it's an expression of fighting through to the death. And all of the tropes, the metaphors, the overtones associated with the 1916 Rising are summed up in figurative form. And it is a superb expression. What's very interesting about the statue is it is located in the post office. Now, given the fact that the post office, the GPO, was the headquarters of the Irish Republic, but the post office also served the British side in terms of some of the staff remaining at their post, then the legacy of the post office was a rather complex one. But this statue elides and writes out, as it were, of the story, that British dimension, and annexes the post office side wholly, solely and exclusively to the Republican cause.
And the reason why the 1916 rebels are commemorated through such statues is because history is written by the victors. Stephen Ferguson.
History is written by the people who win, and they stamp their particular view of events on the historical process. Now, in time, this is redressed and rebalanced, and it's the job of historians always to go back to the sources, to find things that have been overlooked, and to reassess what people have written before. And over time, that's the aim of impartiality and balance. Nobody can escape their own particular views and prejudices. We're all subject to our own little ideas. But over time, I would hope that we'll be able to take into account the views of all the people who participated in this, some of whom, like the post office staff, have been neglected over the years.
Very shortly after the Rising, and for a long time afterwards, a very, very neat narrative emerges. This very simple story of heroic rebels overtaking a despotic government, a heroic stand, and sort of stories and examples that don't fit into this neat narrative really do tend to go missing, because essentially this becomes, particularly after 1922, the Rising is a crucial part of the foundation story of the state. So it makes sense, and particularly for politicians or for political aims, it makes sense to have a very nice, simple narrative that runs the whole way through. And, you know, again, people like the post office staff don't necessarily fit into that. People like Gummersall and these sort of figures who are, you know, really... essentially, they actively oppose the Rising. You know, the majority of the post office staff are Irish men and they're Irish women, and they're actively assisting the British forces in suppressing the rebels by keeping the telegraph open. Samuel Guthrie, for example, who's the superintendent of telegraphs, he was born in Dublin. His assistant, William Pemberton, again a Dublin-born Catholic. Houston Doak, who is a telegraph engineer, again another Dubliner. And these people, you know, their actions, you know, they're brave and they're resolute in the way that the rebels were, but on the other side.
Historian Brian Hughes. So how were the postal staff who maintained government communications throughout the Rising rewarded by their employer? Stephen Ferguson.
All the post office staff, at the end of the day, they got thanked for their efforts, and they got maybe a small amount of overtime pay and a couple of days extra holiday. And that was their reward for, in many cases, putting their lives at risk during the rebellion.
And regarding the vital issue of the importance of a nation to deal with all aspects of its past, historian John Gibney gives his opinion.
If we are to have an honest version of the Irish past and an honest version of, you know, the revolutionary decade, we have to look at all of it. And that means you have to look at an event like the Easter Rising in all its complexities, whether you agree with it or don't. You have to look at the men and women who worked in the Irish Post Office in 1916, because one thing we can't forget is that if we're going to talk about, you know, a building, such as a building that was iconic in the fighting that happened to be a post office, we certainly can't forget the people who actually worked in that post office.
Up to recent times, the role of the Irish postal staff in the 1916 Rising was largely forgotten about. Postal staff during the Rising were vital to restoring communications and facilitating the British government's quick military victory over the rebels.
One thing that the post office staff really do is they facilitate the relatively speedy suppression of the Rising.
Reinforcements were arriving from places like the Curragh and Athlone by Monday night, within hours of the rebellion actually breaking out.
These individual, ordinary Irish men and women in the post office responded as they did. It did have an effect on the outcome of the rebellion in terms of the speed of that outcome.
The cold, hard reality of the Easter Rising is that the British succeeded in crushing it, brutally, quickly.
However, while the British authorities won militarily, nevertheless they failed utterly to win the propaganda war and to win the hearts and minds of the Irish people. Within a short few years, Ireland would eventually achieve the freedom to achieve freedom. And regarding the rebel stance against the British Empire in 1916, I'm going to leave the last word with various contributors.
Given the limited resources and manpower that they had, I think that they did the best they could.
They felt they had to do something that was incredibly importantly symbolic.
It made people stand up and listen.
It was just incredible odds. You could think of the Hungarians fighting the Soviet Empire in 1956, perhaps. It's of that nature, this huge empire locked in a vicious, horrible imperial war in Europe, yet they went out and took them on.
And it turned the entire country and the world, and particularly American public opinion, favourable towards Irish independence.
But it must have made him an impact when we're still talking about it today.
This programme was made with the support of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland, sung by Cliff Wedgebury. This programme was also inspired by Stephen Ferguson's book Business as Usual, GPO Staff in 1916, available from Mercier Press.
John Bull mobilised, the troops were on their way. Porrick Pierce surrendered on the 6th rebellious day. Rebel HQ, GPO, creation of a free state were Pierce and Connolly's plan. Their noble aims were thwarted when the army cannons rang. And from that terrible beauty, as the words of Yeats would say, the birth of the Irish nation from ashes rose that day. Rebel HQ, GPO. And from that terrible beauty, as the words of Yeats would say, the birth of the Irish nation from ashes rose that day. Rebel HQ, GPO.